Hello and welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Taylor, and on the podcast we discuss all aspects of technology and life in international schools, with new episodes live every 2 weeks. We focus on people who are currently working in schools, and we talk about life in their current country and dive into some specific topics. The podcast is brought to you by ACER for Education. People always ask what Chromebooks we recommend and what Windows laptops we recommend, and after trying literally all of them, we always recommend ACER. If you'd like to get more info and try out some devices, please just go to gg.gg/ACER Education. That's gg.gg/ACER Education, and we'll get right back to you. Also, the podcast is brought to you by Apps Events. We're a Google partner. We work all around the world. We've just got one piece of new information right now. This is in January 2021. We're a G Suite Enterprise for Education partner. That's Giuseppe. This is a bunch of premium tools available to people using Google at their schools. We can help you get set up with a free 1-month trial. So please check out the link in the show notes and we'll do that right away. And now, on to the interview. Hello, welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm here with my co-host and friend, John Micton. How are you doing, John?
Great, really well done, thank you. And I'm just really excited to have Dr. Arnie Bieber here. This is going to be a great conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, fantastic. So our guest is Arnie Bieber, who's the director of the International School of Prague and is retiring this year after, I believe, 13 years or 14 years in the job. Welcome, Arnie, to the podcast.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, John. Great to be here. Great to see you guys and hear you. Let me make first one quick correction. I've been careful not to say retiring because there's too much finality associated with that word.
Sure.
So, and I certainly plan on doing lots of different things after I leave ISP, but I'm certainly stepping away from my position as ISP director. So that is certainly the case, and it has been 13 years. And actually, apparently that's a record for the International School of Prague, which was founded in 1948.
Fantastic. Well, just to be clear, I didn't mean retiring from the International School of Prague, not retiring from work. I definitely got to be careful with this terminology. So Arnie, like John knows you much better than I do. And I think what's really interesting is what John's told me about your background. You did quite a few things and you got into education quite late. I believe you went back to university. So can we just kind of start from the beginning and like what you did after school? Talk us through that, because I think that you did some pretty interesting things.
I was born and raised in New York City. I was born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. And I come from a very Orthodox religious Jewish family. So those folks you see with the beards and the side locks and the big hats, that's where I come from. My mother was born in Romania. She's a Holocaust survivor. She survived Auschwitz, lost her mother and lots of other family members. And my father was born in the States. So just by way of background, I'm just about first generation American, 1.5 for generation American. So when I left home, I got involved with lots of different things. Music has always been an important part of my life. And I did lots of different jobs before I got into education. I drove a taxi, I worked on a tugboat, and I probably had 30 other jobs. I sold shoes, I pumped gas, I washed dishes and pots and pans and many, many other things in between. And I don't see that as a deficit in my resume. I think it helped prepare me in many ways for my life as an educator. But that's where I started. And as I mentioned, music was a big focus for me. And so when I started into university, and I started late into that as well, I did start by studying music, classical guitar and music composition and that sort of thing. I pretty quickly realized that wasn't going to really fly in terms of making a living, that I didn't really feel like I had what it took to pursue that to the nth degree. But again, that was certainly a big part of forming who I am. And frankly, also the journey of coming out of this very Orthodox environment. I went to a yeshiva, which is a parochial school, religious parochial school for boys in New York in a number of different schools. And so again, even the word parochial, you can sense the narrowness of this, or the sheltered aspect of that in many ways. So a big part of my journey after I left home was to break away from all of that and to figure out things for myself. And that took a long time. And I won't go into all the ins and outs of my rebellious years, but you can imagine growing up in New York City in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, what that was like. Driving a taxi was sort of like, the movie Taxi Driver. It wasn't very much different from that kind of an experience, for example. So I basically looked for whatever I could do, trying to find myself along the way. And, as I mentioned, being involved with music, I also ended up studying, have two master's degrees, one in educational leadership and one in teaching music. So I began to get more involved with the idea of teaching. I used to teach privately as a classical guitarist. And so I pursued that and then began to see a pathway because I enjoyed working with people and teaching. So I saw a pathway into that. But before that, I also ran a pretty successful catering business in New York. And we did concessions at different Broadway houses and theaters in New York City, and we did all kinds of on-site catering and that sort of thing. And again, I thought that was great preparation because I had to learn a lot about running a business and finance from that end of things, and working in the private sector. So again, all useful training. But eventually I got into teaching and teaching music. I started my teaching career in the Bronx at a junior. It was originally a middle school, junior high school in the Bronx. I did that for 3 years, which was, an eye-opener, as you can imagine, although this was one of the better schools, even though it was a public school. It was one of the better schools in the Bronx.
And how old were you, Arnie, when you started teaching then?
So let's see, I was about 30, early 30s. So it took me a while to get to that point. I actually didn't, even though I didn't go the traditional route. So, I mean, for example, my bachelor's and master's, my first master's degree I earned in 1984, 85. So I was in my early 30s or late 20s by then. And as I said, I did many other things before I decided to go back to university. I did go early on to conservatory in the 70s. I went to Manhattan School of Music for a few years, and I studied classical guitar, which was a wonderful experience. And then I had quite a detour, but eventually studied music composition at Brooklyn College, and then got my master's. But that was in my early 30s that I ended up really getting into education and teaching. So in the Bronx, teaching for a few years, really fascinating experience. And I had this itch to go abroad. So I left the States and moved to Munich, Germany. I had a German girlfriend at the time. I found a job at the Bavarian International School as a music teacher. This is after getting my first master's degree. And so I started teaching instrumental and choral music, as well as I taught from elementary all the way through high school, IB as well, and just cut my teeth on international teaching at the Bavarian International School. I started in 1993 over there, and eventually broke up with my girlfriend, met my future and current wife, Marianne, who's a British citizen, and in 1996 we moved to Caracas, Venezuela, where I worked at the Colegio Internacional de Caracas, starting as a music teacher and a music department chair, and working my way through various admin roles, curriculum coordinator, IGCSE coordinator, assistant principal, middle school principal, secondary school principal, and so on. I did that over a 6-year period. And then we intersected quite a lot of chaos in Venezuela. And I don't know if I'm going into too much detail here, but you
No,
can
no,
cut
it's
out
good.
whatever you don't.
This
No,
is
it's
great,
good. It's
Arnie.
great.
No, no.
More details better. People love the stories. Yeah.
Okay. So, Venezuela, again, was an amazing eye-opener. We arrived in 96 with Marianne 4 months pregnant. Having children in South America was fascinating as well. But it was such a wonderful experience and so different from what I started into. As I mentioned, just to backtrack a little bit, uh, I grew up learning all about the Holocaust through the eyes of my mother. And then living in Germany and having a German girlfriend was not only a shock to her system, but was a shock to my system as well. And so there was a lot of culture shock, the first in Germany and then moving to Venezuela, such a different vibe, not to mention the gorgeous weather, but, the tropics essentially. But we had 2 kids born in Venezuela, Joshua and Emma. And during that time, I moved from a music teacher, department chair, into becoming a administrator. By the end of our stint in Venezuela in 2002, we moved to my first headship, or director's position at the American International School of Bucharest. And that was interesting because, as I mentioned, my mother was born in Romania. And so I'd never been to Romania except for the interview. So that was a fascinating transition where the family, 2 young children, Marianne and I, moved to Bucharest, Romania, and set up shop there. And this was a school in transition as well, had been, like ISP, created decades earlier, but was just moving into a brand new, beautiful, purpose-built campus. And a big part of my job was to increase the enrollment over the next few years, which we did. And there I really was able to flex my leadership muscles, if you will. So back in the early days, I always was a rather progressive educator and was trying to push the envelope. But this was the first time that, if you will, I was in charge. And so the buck stopped with me, but it also meant that I could have more of an impact. And so during that time, we were there for 6 years. It was another great experience, very international environment at AISB, and eventually moved to the International School of Prague, where I've been for the past 13 years. One other comment about Romania, we can maybe get into other things, but just on a personal note, one of the things we did that was quite amazing was we traveled to the town my mother was born in and raised in until she and her family were deported to Auschwitz, a little town called Strâmtura, which is in an area in Romania called Maramureș on the Ukrainian border. So we drove there with some friends, some teacher friends with the kids, and we ended up in this town where all of the Jews had already been deported. But, I was in contact with my mother, who told me where to go and where to look and that sort of thing. We went to the city hall and they greeted us, I think, a little nervously because they were wondering what we were doing there. I think they were worried we were trying to reclaim the house my mother grew up in, which we weren't. But we actually met with someone who took us to the home that my mother was born and raised in until they were deported. And there was a little old lady standing next door with a babushka on her head. I think she came up to my belly button. She was so small. Her name was Maria. And as we were walking towards this house that my mother grew up in, although the house isn't there, but the property, she started yelling out the name of one of my mother's sisters. And we walked up to her and were introduced. And I don't speak Romania, but we had this woman help translate. And so it turned out she was a little girl living next door to my mother's family. And she remembered my grandmother, who I never met, and described her to me and told me how she was this tall, elegant lady, and she was very nice. And she used to come over regularly and bring us milk because your family had a cow. And so, it was just this amazing connection. It's one of the one of the wonders of, this international world that we live in, and international school world, that we were able to make this amazing connection. The kids were with us and they got to see this connection. And this woman, Maria, described to us, she invited us over, we had coffee in her little home. And she described remembering the day. Obviously, she wasn't Jewish, but she remembered the day that they rounded up all the Jews and put them on horse-drawn carts, and how everyone was crying, and that she remembers that day. And there was this amazing connection to my past that we were able to make by having that visit. So that was really an amazing, I guess, high point in our time in Romania.
What an anecdote, Arnie, and also that connection and you being able to hear the history of that event through a first-person voice. That's amazing. What a rich story.
Did your mother ever get to come with you to Romania when you were living there?
My mother actually did come to Romania. She also visited us in Prague. And by the way, she's 97, still alive and kicking in New York City. She, in both Romania, in Bucharest and in Prague, not only did she visit, she never went up to the town. She didn't want to go back. She just felt it was too painful, too emotional, and there wasn't anyone there for her to visit except for a small graveyard. But in both visits in Bucharest and in Prague, she made it her business to meet with the high school students and to speak to them about her experiences. She felt an obligation to do that. She always did that as we were growing up. She always told me stories about what happened. So she wanted to meet, and the school wanted her to meet, obviously, with the kids, to, again, as John says, to have this first-person eyewitness, if you will, account. And so she's met with the kids in both schools, answered lots of questions, and I think it was an amazing educational learning experience for them. I remember when we were in Prague, and this was not that long ago, so she was probably I think she was probably like 87, so maybe 10, 11 years ago. And she came into the classroom, and the teacher introduced her to all the kids. And, my mother's a little woman. She's 5'3", and I'm over 6 feet tall. And I'm standing next to her, and I have a video of this. I'm standing next to her. And the reason I remember it so well is because I just saw it. But I'm standing next to her, and she looks at me and she says, "Why are you standing there?" And I said, "I'm just trying to, be supportive and be with you." And then I pulled up a chair for her. And she said, "I don't want to sit. I want to stand, and go over there. I don't need you to stand next to me." John actually knows my mother, so
I do know your mother, and I can see her doing that because she's an amazing, amazing human being, and I feel honored to have met her and spent time with her.
And she stood there for over an hour just talking and answering questions. And to give you one other little anecdote, I know this is a wide-ranging conversation, but something else that really struck me. So at the end of the meeting, and the kids asked lots of questions, really interesting questions, even questions like, were people attracted to each other? Like, how did boys and girls deal with each other, or, men and women and whatever, And so she answered that. But the last question she was asked was a very heavy question. She was asked if one of the kids asked her if one of the German soldiers came up to you and asked you for forgiveness, what would you do? And she didn't miss a beat, and she gave she said a number of things, and everything she said had two meanings. So she said, "Well, I hope they're all dead by now." And, what was interesting is that meant perhaps I hope they're all dead, or they're all dead by now because they're so old. So that was one piece of it. And then she thought about it some more. And she said, I remember she said, "You can forgive, but you can never forget." And that was her answer. And I think she really felt an obligation to share her experiences. And we all do this in many of our schools. We find Holocaust survivors or survivors of other atrocities and try to connect them with the kids so the kids really understand that these are real things that happen to real people, not just and it's still happening. And so to make that connection is so important. And I'm proud that she felt such an obligation and responsibility to continue to do that.
And I think that's so important. What you're saying is that the kids get a live connection with that, because in this age of fake news and social media, so often these stories are not firsthand. And I think, unfortunately, with many like your mother, that generation is around for a few more years, but then we won't have those voices. And I know some organizations actually have gone to record people's testimonials, so we have that for posterity. I think it's maybe a museum in Washington, the Holocaust Museum, did something when I was there a few
the
years
Holocaust
back.
Museum does it. I think also Yad Vashem in Israel does it.
In Israel, yeah.
And I think maybe even one of the Ivy Leagues, maybe it's Harvard, has their own archives of these kinds of videos.
And what's poignant that what you said, Arnie, is that this is still happening in other places. You said atrocities, and that's the unfortunate thing. We're seeing this multiplied. We have Myanmar, we have Yemen, we have many different places. And I think what your mother did is so powerful and so important. And those students, and I know one of my children was in the room, so those are very poignant moments that they don't forget, and that sticks with them. So wonderful anecdote. You said something at the beginning is, as your Dan introduced you and you talked about your journey, you said it's not a deficit. And it's interesting because often people that are in positions, and especially in education, often many have different journeys that get there. And I have a similar situation where I've done different things. Why do you think, say, a board of governors or a search committee might see that as a deficit, while you actually said, no, it's not a deficit. I want to make sure they know that that has happened. What is the creative tension? What is it that you think, I'm sure as I know, you hire a lot of people. What is it about those experiences that make you a better educator, a better leader? And why do some people think it's a deficit?
It's a great question. The traditional perspective of school is that it's this place of academia, and obviously that's important. The foundational literacies, as the Americans say, the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, are foundational literacies, and they're really important. But as John Dewey said, school isn't about life, school is life. And the idea is that when I say it's not a deficit, it's because that's real life. People who only taught all of their lives, or most of their lives, or only been in schools as professionals, they can be great educators, but their life experiences are defined by those school experiences. People who've done so many other things have been out in the world and seen the world of work. They've interacted with all different walks of life, employed by different kinds of institutions, or had working class jobs and that sort of thing. That is the gamut of what life is about. It's not limited to what happens inside a school. And so I think that's not only is it not a deficit, I think it is a positive. So for example, when I'm hiring people, I am very interested in what their life story is. I'm very interested to see what their perspective is, because they're working with kids, and it's not only about feeding them the curriculum. It's about learning for life, as we like to say. And we want kids to understand something about what the world out there is about. And so I think the most powerful, impactful educators are those who have had many non-educational jobs as well, and have had their own journey to the point where they got to school. Now, maybe that's a little self-serving, because that's my story as well. But for example, to narrow it a little bit, when I'm hiring educators, I am interested in people who have worked in public schools. not just in other international schools, because they come often with a very different outlook about what's possible. Because if you work in a public school, you've got a lot more scarcity. You've got kids from different socioeconomic levels that you don't find in many international schools. You also have to make do because the schools themselves don't have the resources that we have. How lucky we are with the incredible resources that we have at our schools. Many of those things don't exist in public schools, certainly in the United States as well as many other countries. And so they've had to figure out how to make do. They've had classes with 30 kids, and they have learned how to handle those kinds of challenges. And so when they come to an international school environment, they feel so thankful and grateful. And they also come with this can-do attitude because they've seen all of the other ways in which schools have functioned and how they've had to make do. And so they're really excited to take full advantage of the resources and the facility. And so often I find people coming from public schools, for example, they have a broader outlook and they don't take for granted what we have to offer in international school world.
Dan, do you think in your role as an entrepreneur, that journey is less deficit because you want people to have multiple experiences compared to education, which is more geared to the academic? Because you too have had a very, colorful, lot of different things you've done. What do you think as an entrepreneur when you hire people?
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't work for school, but I worked for university, part-time in Prague, Anglo-American University. So I've had that academic role. And, we've talked a lot, John. I've often thought about working for an international school. I got offered some tech director jobs. And I still think about it, to be honest, all the time. I even talked to you about it last week, John.
That's right.
About this. But for me, it's, most of our team are former educators. Almost everyone is a former educator. And, sometimes people like Arnie, maybe they get into education later in life after doing some other things. Sometimes people are educators and they want to try something different, Mm-hmm. So I'm neutral on the topic. I think it's great to do one thing. It's great to do different things. What I think you shouldn't do is just do something because society says, your family or your whatever peer group think you should do something. I think it's good to change. I mean, we only have one life on this planet. And I think it's great what Arnie's done. I think it's, and Arnie might have 2 more careers or more careers in the future. I think what he said is great. It's what suits him and what suits the person.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
I was just going to add, and actually, you obviously do work indirectly for international schools.
Yeah,
because you've done a lot of work with ISP in Luxembourg and lots of other places, and I know you continue to do that. So. That's another way of obviously working closely with international schools and also bringing in a broader perspective.
Yeah. Could I just, Arnie, sorry, one really quick thing, Arnie, just to go back to, because the Venezuela thing is really interesting to me, because I'm not really sure about the time, but at one point in Venezuela, I know it was super wealthy. The Venezuelan Bolivar was it was up there with the Swiss franc, and obviously they've had hyperinflation and the economy's gone to be a total mess. Were you there at the sort of glory days or after the trouble, or was it in between?
It was all of the above. So, we started in 1996. I mean, the thing about Venezuela is that, we came at a pretty good time. However, there's such a disparity between rich and poor, and there are very, very poor people, and there's shanty towns and lots of crime. So even when we were there, we had to be super careful, especially with young children. We had to worry about kidnapping. And, generally the people the teachers who worked at these international schools at our school and the other major school had to live in these gated communities and to be very, very careful. The last 2 years we were in Caracas was when Hugo Chavez was elected the socialist leader. And so that created a lot of turmoil. So it made things a lot worse. Still, the country was quite rich. So because he had just gotten his hands on power and he had to negotiate with the parliament and things were in flux. But there was a lot of anxiety about him taking power. And so we left during our last 2 years were his first 2 years, and things were already starting to get bad, but we missed the worst times. I mean, now Venezuela is decimated. It's just one of the worst places on earth to be. But it was quite beautiful when we were there. And, we would take trips to the rainforests and do all kinds of amazing things, and could do that relatively safely. But these days it's so incredible. The poverty has grown. There's been a huge brain drain. I can think of a lot of the teachers that were at our school, Colegio Internacional, even Venezuelans who left the country, and now many of them live in Florida, for example.
Yeah, wow. Arnie, one of the things that we wanted to spend some time about as you engage in a new chapter and you close a chapter of ISP, throughout your tenure at the International School of Prague, you've really led and been engaged with significant purposeful change in the way a school approaches learning, student voice, and innovation. And this is something that I think watching your goodbye video that your community had for you, you have had an immense impact on the school, and also you have a global reputation. What have been some of your most important provocations you've experienced as an educator, as a human being, that maybe helped you curate and choreograph these changes with your leadership team and board? What were the things that happened to you that kind of said, wow, based on that, this is where my gut is, this is where I want to go? I know, having been part of your leadership team, there was a lot of collaboration and input, but there are things, you were the leader, there are things that happened to you, be it through education or your life, that really helped you choreograph this and curate this, because the result is absolutely outstanding. So be curious what those provocations have been for you.
I love the way that question is phrased, because you're asking what were the provocations, and that's a great way to put it, because I do believe that you don't provoke for the sake of provoking, but you can be very intentional in your provocations in order to try to move things along and to at least generate thinking about various issues. So I think provocations is a good term. Some people don't like it. They find it too either aggressive or in your face, and that sort of thing. But obviously you do it with diplomacy, but if you are a place of learning, then you want to provoke thinking. And so, one of the things I was fortunate about when I came to ISP is the year I arrived, I was asked to create a new mission for the school. Not by myself, as you said, it's very collaboratively, but I was tasked with doing that because the school sort of didn't have much of a mission at the time that was explicit and accepted by the community for whatever reason. And so I was very directly, explicitly tasked with, we need a mission. And so we spent a year, as you know, working collaboratively with all sectors of our community about what is our purpose, what is our why do we exist? And we had many, many workshops. We formed a representative committee of students and staff and faculty and board members. We had like 15 people on this committee, but we spent a lot of time meeting with different constituents and running workshops to really fully understand what we were about. And getting back to your provocative provocation question, I saw my job as also not telling the community what it was about, but I do have a particular bent on the subject, so that was certainly part of the process. I wasn't agnostic about what I thought ISP should be about, and it was building on a certain tradition the school had already. I think it wasn't that formed, but it was there in the culture. So we did that for a year, and we came up with a very different approach to the mission. We came up with these 3 pillars, and I think that they became the provocation, if you will, for the rest of the time I've been at ISP. So the three pillars were to inspire, engage, and empower. Are we still on?
Yeah, we're still on. Dan just stepped out. So when you're talking about those provocations and you were leading this process, you just stated that you actually had some ideas. So there was something in your own heart and your moral compass as an educator that you had gathered or garnished or had taken place. Something happened in your life that brought you to say, this is where education needs to go. Is there a moment or some thing that kind of pushed you and then you suddenly had, because I think one of the things as leaders, the challenge is if you don't have a clear compass of where your north is and you don't stick to that, however hard it is, often that then becomes the north disappears and you're kind of going everywhere. And that's one thing that working at the PTC and looking at aspiring leaders, I really think if you have that compass and you really believe in it intrinsically, be it ethical, pedagogically, what was something that formed that? Because you said, I was being collaborative, but I kind of knew where we had to go. I'm just curious what that was that brought that about.
I'll answer that in 1 second, but I want to just clarify something that it's great you caught that point. But to be clear, I'm not just, when I say collaborative, I'm not just saying it because that's what we're supposed to say. The mission that was created was really formed by the school. So it wasn't like I was that out ahead of everybody else and saying, this is going to be our mission. Let's all collaborate and make it so. But it was about debate and arguing and discussing every single word of the mission. And the mission, I think, was the first provocation, not and it's sort of the foundational provocation. But I just wanted to clarify that what we formed, so even though I had ideas, it's not like I knew all the words were going to be. And so that's what made it very collaborative. And also I think allowed it to stand the test of time. But to get to your question about what drove that way of thinking, that perspective, and so on, part of it is probably my own life experiences. Certainly reading certain individuals, certain very compelling people in this area had a profound impact on me. The two that I would certainly pull out of, there's a lot of people I could point to on many levels, but sort of the original sin in terms of the people that provoked me to want to continue to provoke in this area and to want to disrupt traditional education were, firstly was John Dewey, who I mentioned earlier. And, it's interesting because the guy lived 150 years ago or something, or 130 years ago, the great American educator and philosopher, who his writings and his work really have had a profound effect on education. And if you read him, you see how aligned his thinking was way back before very much tech. He didn't need to say, he didn't need, computers to argue for experiential learning, for example. It's only that the technology we have now allows so much more to happen that weren't possible in the past, because it opens up our world in many ways. And like we're doing right now, we can be in 3 different locations and chatting together. So he certainly had a profound effect on me, especially democracy. He had a piece about democracy in schools, and he was a very deep thinker about what education should be about, really challenging and still challenging, speaking about that provocation that lives on, the things he said way back when are still challenging.
Well, it's amazing how people keep quoting him like he's the new guy on the block,
right.
Which is,
Yeah, so certainly I've been referring to him and thinking about him for at least 40, 50 years. And, people always trot him out. It's a question of really listening to what he talked about, and a lot of the research that's been done bears out what he said way back when. But to what extent it to what extent are we walking the talk is the big question. The other one, more recent, and that was in the early 90s, was the book Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn. So long before Dan Pink wrote, what was the book
Drive.
Drive, right. And if you read Drive, it's kind of an updated version of Punished by Rewards with updated research and that sort of thing. But really, I still think it was his best book. And Alfie Kohn was not primarily an educator. He was writing about education, he was writing about the world of work, and he was writing about parenting. And speaking of provocations, he was incredibly provocative, and he backed up almost everything he said with research. So he didn't just say it. He said, here's the research to back up what I'm saying. Attacking grades as a way, as something that inhibits risk-taking, because you end up going for the reward of the grade as opposed to actually learning and having that intrinsic motivation. Explaining the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. He talked about how behaviorism works. Pavlov's dog works. If you want if you want to get the dog to salivate, or a human being to do certain things on a superficial level, behaviorism works. You can get them to do it. But to get people to think deeply, to deeply learn, to be able to really engage in a deep way, that extrinsic motivation is not what makes it work. And it's not how people learn. And then that's been updated by people like Carolyn Dweck when she talks about the growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, for example. This duel between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, that had a deeply profound effect on my thinking. And it's something that I've always hearkened back to one way or another, because I think that's the core of what we struggle with in school. Because school, unfortunately, I don't want to get into the politics of it at too deep a level, but school is about compliance. School is about, yes, we want kids to learn, and we want them to move in certain socioeconomic pathways, and generally not skip over from one to the other. And it's designed to move cohorts of people from different socioeconomic groups along a certain pathway. And it's a track. And so it requires a certain level of compliance. And that is one of the biggest challenges in school, because we talk about learning, but it's learning within a very structured track. And so as long as we can do it that way, it's okay. As long as we have standardized tests, as long as we have grades, as long as we have a siloed curriculum where you go from, cohorts go from math and they get up, and then go to science and they get up and they go to social studies. As long as we have that level of control, there's a sense of safety that we're producing the kinds of either workers or white collar workers or intellectuals or whatever it is that society wants. And it's very hard to break out of that structure. So that had a profound effect on me.
Well, and punishment by rewards, it's terrible. I love it too. And we have a lovely little anecdote, Dan. Arnie and I got invited by Apple to go and present in Singapore. And we sat down, and to my left was Simon Sinek, and to our right was Dan Pink. We were like, oh, great, now we're going to present. So, and Steve Wozniak was there too. It was It was like, we were like, what are we going to say? So that's just a little Dan Pink anecdote that we had, just small. Arnie, so, you have shared, I think, what's are very important aspects about this idea of, being almost imprisoned by the schedules, imprisoned by years of doing things and being extrinsic instead of intrinsic. You have brought this school to a place that other schools are looking at and like, whoa, how did this happen? And so often people talk about this, and there are educators around the world that talk about what you talk about. They believe in it. They can sit in a room and convince you, but there's a hesitancy to jump. And that jump is the critical step to do to actually begin that journey. But so many people hesitate. And I think, Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that's often the case as taking risk as an entrepreneur or as a business. You just have to kind of jump and say, you know what, we're going to give it a shot. What is it, the hesitancy? Is it because outside forces become too strong? Is it because maybe as directors and school leaders like yourself, there's a point of no return where you have to say, okay, hold on here. Am I going to put my job on the line for this? You know, I'm curious what you have experienced yourself as a leader, pushing board members and your community, your staff and parents to jump, because everybody had to jump. Everybody had to do something differently. And you are, you know, well respected amongst school leaders, and you talk with other school leaders. What is that hesitancy? What's stopping us from doing this?
Yeah, it's another really good question. I mean, certainly fear is a big factor. There's a fear factor. I also think it's the environment of schools in general, international or otherwise. And international schools tend to be more progressive environment than other kinds of schools, but not always. But I think one of the fears is I mentioned that sort of socioeconomic environment that we're in. I think that creates fear and a constraint, because you have to deliver certain expected outcomes. So there's fear of the parent community. There's fear that parents want certain things, and you better deliver what they want, what they expect, whether it's getting into certain universities or getting certain grades and that sort of thing. I think it's fear of, I mentioned university. That's a big piece of it, especially as kids get into high school. What schools are kids going to get into, and what do I need to do to prepare them? And all of those things are important. So I'm not denigrating the importance of those things. There's lots of ways to get to those things. But I think primarily schools, more than other industries, are in this cocoon, they're in a bubble they're protected in ways that the outside world of work isn't. They tend to be much more conservative environments where change happens extremely slowly. And so I think the other big challenge is that there isn't an answer. It's not like, and it's not like Arnie has the answer either. It's not like I know we need to do this or that. There are directions I think we need to go in. I need to have a compass and a why and an understanding of what the research says. It's a lot easier to talk about what's wrong with schools than it is to talk about what is the solution. And every school has its own context. I think the challenge and the constraint is that it's about kids. And so we're afraid we want to make sure we do right by them. We want to make sure we do right by them and not in any way hurt their what they need, and we want to give them what they need. Of course, I also believe by doing nothing or very little, we're actually it's actually a negative for kids, not a positive. So, you know, you may hear people saying you can't treat kids like guinea pigs. Absolutely not. But if you don't take informed risks in terms of, or chances or experiments or prototyping, if you don't take it, basically understand the research and then try things, it's actually going to be to the detriment of kids, because that won't prepare them for the world that they're going into. So schools are detached from often detached from the real world. You know, our mission talks about providing an authentic global education, or global, I forget the order there, but that word authentic is about it being real world and connected and relevant. And, you know, David Perkins, the head of the Harvard, what used to be the head of, what was the educational?
Graduate School of Education? No.
Yes. So he was the head, and he's still with them. But, you know, he, not that long ago, and this guy has not only a doctorate in education, but also a doctorate in mathematics. And he said, and I quote, or close to a quote, 95% of the curriculum is a waste of time. This is a very well-educated, and this is a math person. He'll tell you most of what you learn in math is a waste of time. He'll challenge you and say, why are kids learning the quadratic equation? What is the relevance to their learning? What is the purpose? And so I know I'm veering off a little bit to your
Not
question
at all, not at all, not at
about
all.
the constraints. But I think that one of the big constraints is also the lack of having a clear way forward, and the fear of getting it wrong. If you're an administrator, you may be the fear of losing market share in terms of having, kids. I mean, ISP like your school is a not-for-profit, and that gives us the luxury of it not being about making a profit, even though we should do well financially and be a responsible financial institution. But the focus is on the mission and what we're trying to achieve. But still, there's that fear. There's that bubble in that fear. And just to be clear, ISP, even though we've been trying to push the envelope, even though I've been trying to push, we've all been working together on this for a long time. We have so far to go. Schools have so far to go. And I look around the world and I can see a handful of schools that I feel have gotten much closer to the ideal of what we're looking for. So I think another constraint is it's easier. It's like, we talk about grades, for example. It's a lot easier to say that a kid is an A student or has a 90% because you can add up the grades and you can average them out and say, you're a 90, you're an 80, you're an A, you're a C. Of course, the problem is that doesn't reflect learning. That's a mathematical formula. It's not a reflection of real learning. And often it's a reflection of superficial learning, not a real deep kind of learning. But it's easier because if you don't do that, and that's the way it's been done for hundreds of years, what does the alternative look like? What does meaningful feedback look like? And so getting back to your other question about provocation, I think a big part of my job is not to let a necessity become a virtue, not to make a virtue out of a necessity. So there are certain things we have to do. Let's not make believe that it's necessarily in the best interest of kids. Let's be honest and say we have to do certain things, whether it's grades, although we've tried to break that scenario as much as possible as well, or standardized tests, for example. Let's not make believe that those are virtues, that those are really the ideal. And I think in schools, we often have a tendency to take the status quo and say, well, that's what we're all about. That's what we're trying to achieve. When in fact, we know that that's not in the best interest of kids. So I think those two sides are that the provocation of not making a virtue out of a necessity, that in and of itself is a constraint. That necessity is a constraint. And then the other external forces. And in terms of how to break through that, it's calling a spade, as I just said. But it's also building partnerships. It's about bringing parents and board members into the mission of the school and into the direction of the school at every possible turn. Because you work around your parent community, you work around your board at your own peril. You have to engage with them and tell it like it is and have those debates, because they also represent that fear. I want my kid to get into Harvard, and what are you going to do to get my kid into Harvard? And that's what it's all about. Certain people feel that way. Certain board members feel that way. And so we as leaders have to be willing to engage with them or with teachers and really partner with them, partner with parents. We've done this thing for many years called the Edge in Education, where when we bring in experts, when we're trying to move in certain directions, we always bring parents into the conversation. We always set up a forum where the parents are interacting with the expert about what we're trying to accomplish and letting them challenge, but also for them to feel like they're part of that journey. So I think that's part of the answer in schools. I also think the partnerships need to go beyond inside the school community. I think they also need to be this sort of global partnerships, but real partnerships, not just talking, but figuring out ways to implement action, to have an impact, and to do things together, because it can be strength in numbers. When different schools, like-minded schools, can work together. Some of that has happened, but distance also gets in the way, right? Even if you can talk on Zoom or whatever, but you're still, one school's in India and one school's in Europe, and other schools in China. Well, you can only do so much together. So figuring out ways to work together and to build those collaborative groups, I think, is really important. But it's a huge challenge. And also the other thing with international schools in particular is that we have some unique challenges. For example, the transient nature of our schools, the fact that you have people coming and going constantly. So if you're building on a mission, but you keep having new constituents and new faculty and staff coming into the school, every year you have to start from scratch at the same time that you're building understanding with everybody else.
Fantastic, Arnie. I've got a quick question. I know we're getting close to the time. I want to make sure I get this one in because I think it'll be interesting for our audience. I've got so many questions, but I know we've got an hour. You've got all kinds of people working for international schools. You've got educators who are maybe looking to move on to a leadership position. You've also got people hired locally. Obviously John's helped several people move up to tech positions at other international schools. You've had a successful career by any standard. What advice could you give maybe that people don't get from anyone else about how to be successful, build a successful career? Do you have one or more pieces of advice that you've learned from your time?
Yeah, there are a number of things I can think of. Firstly, if you want to be a leader in an international school or any organization, then you should lead. And what I mean by that is sometimes people want to be an administrator, and the attitude might be something like, I'll really start leading once I get that role or get that title. And so the reality is that you can always lead. And what's one of the things we always talk about in our school is that everyone is a leader. You're leading from your positions. Kids need to lead, and not just lead other kids. They need to lead us, because we take what they can do not for granted. We don't realize how far they can go if we give them the opportunity. So in terms of leadership kinds of roles and growing professionally, you need to be a leader, and we need everyone to lead. And there are all kinds of leaders. Leaders aren't just people who stand on the stage and talk or exhort other people to do things. They lead by example. They can lead quietly. But that actually doing the thing that you aspire to is really important. And the other thing is to constantly challenge yourself, so that I think you need to challenge your assumptions about what you believe or what you've been taught to believe about school, and then constantly try out new ideas and do it in some sort of intentional way to build your practice and to see what really works, because that will constantly improve what you do as an educator. I mean, those are a few of the things. Obviously, the networking and interacting with people around the world is very, very important as well. And anyone who's passionate about what they do as an educator and does those kinds of things, I think, can definitely progress in this profession.
Great.
I think it's interesting that you brought this idea up, is that we, or society, feels that you can only be a leader when you're a director or a CEO. And there's this wonderful TEDx by Drew Dudley called Everyday Leadership. And he really says that everybody's a leader, and that somehow we're almost scared to lead because we've made it such a privilege and such a special thing you get after a certain while. And that actually, I think what is so refreshing hearing from you, Arnie, is that leading doesn't mean you're in the front. You could be in the back leading or on the side. And I think that's just very powerful, this idea of everyday leadership.
And I think that the job of leaders, of directors or heads of school or principals, is to create that autonomy, the culture of autonomy, professional autonomy, where if the school is clear about the why it exists, what does learning mean at our school? So at ISP, we have learning principles, for example, and other frameworks that we can follow, but then to have the trust that professionals working together can have the space to try out new ideas and collaborate with others, as opposed to everyone having to follow along in the same script. Any organizations, it's not just schools. I'm a big one of the other seminal writings that John, that one of my heroes is Peter Senge, and the idea of the fifth discipline, and the idea that we have to work together as a system, but that everyone needs personal mastery over their own craft, and we need to give people the professional autonomy to be able to excel in their own area. And that's a big part of leadership. But the schools need to, we have to permit that we have to set the culture and set the stage for people to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, and what's so interesting is so many things that you're describing and talking, and kind of these anecdotes and the different pathways. When I read leadership books about companies, so much transcends both areas. I don't know, Dan, if you would agree, because you're a leader of a company. There's so many of this idea of having a mission and a clarity and a why. Would that echo with your own experience?
Yeah, definitely. I want to add something about what Arnie said, which I think is really, in case people missed it, it's a really concrete piece of advice, which was if you want to be a leader, lead. I mean, I think when I know people, let's say you're applying for a leadership position at another school, the first thing they're going to look at is where did you enter the last school and where did you leave? Did you take on leadership? Maybe it wasn't just a leadership role, but were you coaching a sports team? I'm sure, Arnie, when you look at people, you want to see that they've shown signs of that leadership before they applied for the job.
No question. And like you said, I think the other thing we need to do, and it's connected to this leadership piece, is think out of the box about who we hire. Yeah. And it circles all the way back to the beginning of this conversation. People can be amazing, impactful leaders, and it doesn't necessarily slot in. Jim Collins talks about getting the best people on the bus. You can have very powerful leaders, and they can make a huge difference in your organization, and they should be considered even if they don't exactly, fit the job description in terms of they did this check, but that they clearly proven themselves as a leader. But absolutely, you want to look for people, and in your own organization, moving up within the organization, even if they're already in the school, to see that they've actually taken on leadership roles. Not only in name, or even less importantly in name, more importantly in what kind of impact have they made. And that's what we should all be looking for.
Yeah.
Arnie, thank you. This has been fantastic, and we so appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your experiences. Any parting words, any thoughts? We have an international school audience. A lot of people are logging in because it has to do with directorships and leaderships. Any, little wisdom as you enter the new chapter, or any reflections that you think you would like to share?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that we need to have the courage of our convictions. And if we know something and we understand something, then we need to figure out how to proceed. It doesn't mean just barreling ahead and ignoring everything. It means coming up with smart strategies to make that change happen and not accept the status quo. So we need to have the courage of our convictions. And for me, I'm looking forward to the next, as they say, chapter in my life, to engage with education in a new way, ways like this, like just talking or doing and interacting on a broader scale, not just within one school. And I'm really looking forward to that kind of liberating feeling where I can just spread my wings and take my ideas to different constituents and just get the feedback and see what people are doing around the world. And what you guys are doing is part of that, and it's really important. We need to figure out, let's leverage what we've learned from the pandemic, from doing these kinds of things. Let's leverage it so that we can really make some change happen, because it would be a sad state of affairs if things just kind of flatten back to where they were, because we've learned so much from all of what's happened over the past year or more. And so we need to figure out how to leverage that. There's so many learnings that we've had over the past year and a half. And if I were to maybe end with this one major learning for me, something I've known, but you see how far you can go based on all the work that's been done, everything you've built to that point. So what I mean by that is the work we do day to day, we don't necessarily see the growth and so on, but sometimes it takes a crisis to see what we're made of. And how much agility do teachers have, or do administrators have, or do community members have? But a lot of that has to do with all the work that's happened before. It doesn't just happen at that moment. And so all of that work and preparation, it's almost like a rehearsal for dealing with the pandemic. And that's why many of us are so proud with how the schools have handled things. And it just proves to us about how, if we're forced to do it, we'll do it. So let's feel forced. Let's feel this imperative to make greater change. And we can do it. And I think maybe that's the biggest learning. We've proven that we can do it, so let's do it.
But let's not have a pandemic to do it, please.
No, without one, that would be better.
Exactly. I'm just realizing 13 years ago, us three were in a room and Dan had approached me about starting apps events in the Google Education Conference. And Arnie Bieber was like, of course, let's do it. And that was in 2008. So we don't have glasses, but we have virtual glasses and some virtual champagne. So
no, definitely. ISP was the first school I worked with. John obviously has been instrumental in it. And now, we've got 10 full-time people and a lot of educators we work with. We ran, pre-COVID, a couple hundred events a year, and now we're doing all kinds of things for Google Direct. So it's great. I've got a lot to thank Arnie and John for sure.
Thanks for doing this, guys.
Thank you, Arnie. We wish you all the very best. You're going back home to New York City, and we look forward, and I think we're going to put in our calendar in a year's time. We're going to loop back and see what kind of chaos you're creating in New York.
Well, as you know, every Monday morning, I play music on the PA system, and you won't be surprised to hear I played 2 songs today, which I'd never played before. New York State of Mind and New York Is My Home, just because it's my last PA broadcast. I thought that would be a good way to end the week.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully we can get you back annually, Arnie. It was a great chat. I think maybe even our best chat so far, John. So I think we definitely, if you're on for Arnie, we'll get you back.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, guys.
Thank you so much. And we wish you and Marianne all the very best, good health, and enjoy the new chapter.
Thanks, guys. Same to you.